Oh, well, they were created by some intelligences in Andromeda. Well, okay, that's interesting also, but where did those guys come from? So at some point, we want some natural explanation, not just an intelligence, because we can always ask the one more regressive question, well, who created that intelligence? And so by the arguments of the intelligent design theorists, it seems inevitable that we're going to want to know what, by your own arguments of inferring design, then it seems reasonable to ask, well, then who designed the designer? And I don't think it's a sophomoric question, well, who made God? Yeah, that's what high school kids ask. Well, what's wrong with that? I mean, it's an interesting question. And the inference from design, I think part of the problem is that it's really obvious something like the difference between the face on Mars, which is obviously just an eroded mountain, but our facial recognition software kicks in and we see a face, versus a Mount Rushmore face, which we clearly recognize has intelligence behind it. The reason we're able to infer that is because we have vast experiences of ourselves as intelligent beings making things, artifacts. We have no experience at all of a super intelligent designer coming down and there right before us in the workshop makes some DNA for us or creates an eye for us. That's just pure inference, and there's no known logarithmic process, some algorithm we can apply and say, yes, that is an intelligently designed thing, that DNA, but the RNA isn't. See, there is no testable thing yet. So, I mean, if you guys come up with that, okay, that would be interesting. Finally, I think ultimately the best you're going to be able to find ever in your process is some natural process, some natural forces at work. So let me just make an analogy, my last minute and a half. In a different field that I deal a lot with, and that is ESP and psychic power and so on. And there's a fairly rigorous scientific theory about how this may happen, that people can read each other's minds. It has to do with quantum physics, and that the collapse of the wave function inside these atoms, inside our neurons, happens in a particular pattern that goes across space into your skull and causes your neurons to fire in the same pattern, and that's how we can read each other's thoughts. Okay, I don't happen to think this is true, but it's proffered by Roger Penrose, who's a legitimate scientist and so on. Anyway, it's an interesting theory. But if it turned out to be true, that would not be the paranormal. That wouldn't be ESP. That would just be psychophysics or neuro-quantum physics or something like that. It would just be incorporated into science. And so, gentlemen, I think the best you're going to be able to find with a designer or some kind of intelligence is just yet some other part of nature that we have yet to discover, and then it just gets incorporated and we're just doing science again. And I think that's the best your program can give us. Thank you.
Dr. Meyer and Dr. Sternberg. Concluding statement, 5 minutes.
I think both the gentlemen opposite are insufficiently sensitive to the importance of mind in the cosmos. Our minds. We do lots of cool stuff. We know what a mind can do. We know what it means to be intelligent. As long as we are now debating intelligent design, let me respond to the points that were made. We didn't think this was a debate about we thought it was about the origins of life and evolutionary theory sufficiency, which meant it was mainly about the mechanism, the cause offered by evolutionary theory, which is natural selection, random mutation. But if we want to talk about the origin of life, I'm really happy to do that. I did just write a long book on the topic. Dr. Prothero mentioned in his opening statement, he talked about Stanley Miller and his synthesis of amino acids. Miller and many other prebiotic chemists repudiated the relevance of those experiments late in life because they realized that the conditions under which the amino acids were synthesized did not simulate the conditions on the early Earth. That was problem one. Problem two, when the amino acids were allowed to collect and sit around for a while, a sludge, a chemical sludge accumulated called melanoidin. In order to keep that reaction from taking place between desirable amino acid and byproducts, problem known as interfering cross reactions, intelligent investigators have to intervene and take out reaction products that would cause biochemical reactions to go in an unfavorable direction. That's the hidden hand of intelligence, in this case the scientific investigator, playing a role in moving life or chemicals in a life-friendlier direction. But notice what's happening. The scientific investigator thinks that this is all natural. But what's really going on is a mind is directing the process. Dr. Prothero also talked about these these experiments with RNA, where the investigator is literally sequencing the RNA gene. That's, again, intelligence creating information. What goes on here is that with the materialistic mindset that has grown up around science, that scientists they're looking at nature, but they're not noticing their own intervention in what intelligent minds do. And when you step back and notice that minds have certain powers that material entities do not, you can begin to make inferences about the activity of mind in the past. Now, Dr. Shermer raised the whole question of who designed the designer. One of the chapters in my book that I'm happiest about is the chapter 17 in which I take that on. I'll give you a brief synopsis of my response to that. I agree with him that one of the problems with invoking an immanent intelligence, an alien within the cosmos, is that it does lead to this kind of infinite regress. That's one of the reasons I favor the theistic design hypothesis over the spaceman hypothesis favored by, for example, Richard Dawkins, or at least tendered by him at the end of the movie Expelled, or tendered by Francis Crick. Another reason I favor the theistic design hypothesis is that there's also evidence of design from the very beginning of the universe and the fine-tuning of the laws of physics and chemistry, something I agree with Francis Collins about. When people say, well, who designed the designer, they're just, again, privileging materialistic thinking, materialistic explanations. You can say the same thing of the evolutionary hypothesis. So you accept the neo-Darwinian hypothesis, you can ask who evolved the evolver. If you concede, as many evolutionary biologists have done, such as Richard Dawkins, that there is no adequate undirected evolutionary explanation for the origin of the first life, you do the same who designed or who evolved the evolver infinite regress question on him. He accepts biological evolution, but it can't get started without chemical evolution, and he accepts that there isn't such a process. The real point is that in any metaphysical system, and now I'm not talking about scientific reasoning, but in any ultimate metaphysical explanation has to go back to some primitive, something from which everything else comes. And the question in modern philosophy of science is what is the best candidate to be that primitive, to be that thing from which everything else comes. I think post-Big Bang theory, post the solutions to the field equations of general relativity, implying that you have a true singularity at the very beginning of the universe, in which the spatial volume of the universe curves on itself so tightly that you have a true singularity. I think the best candidate is to be that thing from which everything else comes is not a material entity. How much space can you put in zero spatial volume? None. I mean, how much matter can you put in zero spatial volume? So I think with the new cosmology, you can ask the question, which of these two metaphysical systems provides a better starting point? I think that's one of the reasons I'm a theist, but we weren't debating that tonight. We were just debating the adequacy of the neo-Darwinian mechanism, that is to say, modern evolutionary theory.
Please join me in thanking all four participants in tonight's wonderful debate.